Welcome back to Trauma Healing and Prevention Services. This week we are reading They Walked into the East to Meet the Rising Sun. To pick up where we left off, the grandmother and the young girl have left the sleeping camp of children who are preparing for their coming of age. If you missed the first video, it's linked up in the upper right-hand corner. The young girl noticed the grandmother had a bow and a quiver of arrows slung over her shoulder, and a determined look to her face. This was not the time to ask questions, and the young girl tried to remember all the directions they had been given the night before. She was supposed to have a water skin given to her by the grandmother, and she wasn't to return until the skin was empty and she had had her vision. She wasn't to eat anything until she returned, because she had eaten her last meal as a child, and the grandmothers would see that she was fed as an adult when she returned. Also, she was to be alone for her inner journey, and when she returned, she was to have a gift to offer to her people. If she had a sponsor, she would also be responsible for giving a gift to her sponsor. But she hadn't taken the time to create a relationship with a specific sponsor. She had spent the last fall, winter, and spring taking care of all the grandmothers who arrived with the different groups of people. So, she walked in silence beside this grandmother she had never been properly introduced to, trusting that she was doing the right thing, and the grandmother would correct her if she did not. They walked in silence like this, over hills and through grassy meadows. Birds greeted them, singing lovely songs before the birds returned their attention to finding food for their young. They walked until the young girl's legs began to protest the very long-legged pace of the grandmother. And when the young girl started trying to decide if it was acceptable to ask for a sip from the water skin, the grandmother abruptly angled to the right, where they found a small stream. "Drink from the stream," she commanded, "as we haven't yet reached the cave for you to wade in." And the grandmother put her entire head in the stream of water to drink, flinging back her head and her hair when she was done, so the droplets flew in the late morning light. Small birds caught some of the droplets in the air and then flew away. The young girl drank from the stream, though not as gracefully as the grandmother. The water was cold and sweet and promised the big cold blue ice if they were to follow the stream to its place of origin. As the young girl opened her mouth to ask about the cave, the grandmother put her fingers to her lips again, indicating it was still time to be quiet. "You have no questions that I can answer for you. And if you ask them out loud, you are not listening to those who do have the answers. I am merely your guide to the land that selected you to listen. Either you will, or you won't. It has nothing to do with me." With that, the two of them set off on their trek again, and now their shadows pointed the way. The sun was behind them, seeming to herd them towards a pre-selected destination, in an area the young girl didn't remember ever having traveled with her people. As they traveled, she noticed the berry bushes that only grow along the people's paths. Since they traveled in silence, walking lightly on the land and leaving no trace, with the wind always coming towards them, the young girl frequently saw the large horns of elk in the grasses, as well as large hills that looked like they were covered in long, furry fur. She had never traveled so far from the caves her people used, and soon her fear was overtaken by her normal inquisitive nature. She kept her questions to herself, however, as the grandmother had been quite clear about traveling in silence. As the sun began to drop behind the horizon behind them, the lights of all the ancestors who had come before her lit the sky. She knew if she looked behind her, she would see the great path that led her people to the Summerlands, where the ancestors watched over the people. Even in the dark, with the lights the ancestors held, they continued their walk to the east in silence, only stopping to drink from the small streams they crossed. When she thought her legs could carry her no further, the lights from the ancestors in front of her began to grow dark, as if one of the giant hills was now standing up and walking toward them. The air grew ever colder now that the sun had gone down, and the young girl picked up her pace to keep up with the grandmother. More and more of the lights from the ancestors went dark in front of her and to the left. The young girl was no longer intrigued or feeling inquisitive. She was beginning to have to swallow around a growing lump in her throat, and her chest felt like it was too small to get enough air. These weren't clouds covering the lights of the ancestors. It was a growing physical presence, far taller than the white cliffs near the deep water her people had spent one summer living along. She stopped feeling tiny and began to feel insignificant. Was this where she was going to be left alone until her water skin was empty? Was she supposed to stay here alone and make her way back to her people alone? Or would the grandmother stay with her? If the grandmother stayed with her, would she have to be silent the whole time? She usually would sing to herself when she did her chores to help pass the time. How long would she have to stay silent? Abruptly, the grandmother stopped and sniffed the wind with her head lifted high. Then she bent over until the young girl could feel the grandmother's breath on her cheek. And then her ear. This is not a safe place to smell like fear. Whatever you are thinking, you need to change. Think good thoughts, or think no thoughts. Think of being as large and as expansive as the sky. Think of being one with everything. Or think only of breathing. Just stop thinking of whatever you were thinking. And with those helpful directions, the grandmother walked with a longer stride to a tree the young girl swore hadn't been in front of them earlier. At the tree, there were leather straps tied at the grandmother's shoulder level, and stones placed at specific intervals along the ground. The grandmother looked at all the leather straps and paid close attention to one dyed red, with several knots on one tied end. Grandmother took a leather strap out of her pouch and tied it right below the multi-knotted strap. Then, she directed the young girl to follow her to the north, and they walked into the frigid wind that blew their hair back behind them. The young girl realized the lights of the ancestors were blocked ahead, but they showed a path that meandered over just to the right of their forward progress. After the grandmother led them around uneven ground that surrounded a small hill, their route followed the path lit by the ancestors. The young girl was beginning to struggle to keep up with the long stride of the grandmother. Each time she caught her thoughts starting to wander into, "What will I do?" territory. She reminded herself to focus on her long, slow breath in and her long, slow breath out. Traveling in this fashion, the grandmother and the young girl finally made it to the grandmother's destination, a narrow opening in cliffs that rose straight up out of the earth and reached up high to the lights of the ancestors. As the moon rose in the east, the cliffs glowed eerily, reflecting the light of the moon. With a single-minded focus, the grandmother approached the steep cliffs, her head tracking side to side, looking for some variation the young girl was unable to discern. It was immediately obvious to the young girl that the grandmother knew exactly what she was looking for, and equally obvious once she found it. The grandmother's gait lengthened even further, and her head looked straight ahead, though subtle changes in her shoulders and slight movements of her neck let the young girl know that while the grandmother may be focused on the path ahead, she was equally aware of the young girl, as well as slight movements in the rushes along the stream and the grasses behind them. Once they arrived at the cliff, the grandmother reached up, grabbed hold of a small protuberance on the cliff face, and lifted herself up to a small ledge with minimal apparent effort. She indicated the young girl was to follow, then turned further into the ledge and began to unload the small pack she had carried. The young girl looked at the cliff face and noticed it was not as smooth as it first appeared. Focusing again on the long, slow breath in, she wedged her fist into a crevice halfway between the ground and the protuberance the grandmother had grabbed. She pressed her thumb into the opening just above her knuckles and pressed her fingers down into the cliff just below her palm. She then slid her other hand along the cliff face until she found a protuberance a little above her head. Grabbing tight, she jumped and got her feet up on the cliff face parallel with her lower hand. From this angle, she saw another fissure close to her right foot, and she inched her toes into the fissure and held tight with her toes. Then, trusting her body to do as she asked, despite her hunger and exhaustion, she let go of the fissure with her right hand, while pushing off with her left foot to jettison her body toward the opening in the cliff face, currently supporting her right foot. She stayed focused. Long, slow breath in as her right hand found new purchase, and her left foot stabilized itself against the cliff face. She was almost a third of the way up to the ledge the grandmother was apparently setting camp on. Rather than allow the hunger and exhaustion to start the tears hanging out in her eyes, she blinked rapidly and looked at the cliff face, alert for any shadows cast by the moon. There! Just above her head, but still out of reach, was the protuberance the grandmother had so effortlessly grabbed when she first reached the cliff. Crossing her left arm over her right, she pulled herself tight against the rock face, her right foot still in the base of the fissure. Both hands gripped tight, she bent her left leg so her left foot could press on the cliff directly underneath her. She was too short to just stand, even if she could, and reach the protuberance. There were no other handholds she could see, or fissures in the rock she could use. Somehow, she had to jump vertically to grab the grandmother's protuberance as she had come to identify it in her head. Breathe in. Breathe out. Breathe in. Breathe out. And with that outward breath, she focused on going straight up and getting both hands on the protuberance, which turned out to be a different, rougher type of rock than the colder, slicker rock of the cliff face. She had put all of her effort and all of her energy into the vertical leap, and as her hands grasped the rock, her feet kept going. Up and up and over her head. As she began to fear she would soon be crashing back down to the ground below, she felt the grandmother's rough hand grab her ankle. "That may be the first time I have seen anyone crawl up to my ledge, upside down," cackled the grandmother. The young girl looked around and noticed the ledge was actually a cave. Rocks outlined a fire pit against the upper area, and firs covered bulrushes against the far wall. A natural crevice carried smoke out of the cave above the fire. The grandmother had moved several larger rocks to reveal small tied leather bags, and she was sniffing each bag as she brought it out of its hiding spot. 2 bags that hadn't been covered well enough had been chewed on by juvenile voles, as the rocks had been too tightly packed to allow any adults in. "Use your nose," said the grandmother. "Tell me, who has been here before us?" The young girl closed her eyes so she could pay attention to the information her nose gave her. There was a very old, very faint smell of wet bear, but when she looked around, it was obvious no bear could get in here. Therefore, she must be smelling one of the furs wrapped around the bulrushes. She closed her eyes again and scented many, many old fires. The smell of the mosses that grow along the river and stream banks, the smell of women's sweat, but no sharp, acrid smell of men's sweat. She smelled dried berries and the seeds of the yellow and orange flowers. She smelled the feathers of a large predator bird and the sweeter smell of fresh bone. The bone was the newest thing in the little cave besides them, based on the strength of the smell. She could smell the grandmother like sun-baked earth and auric oil. She could smell her own sweat like sun on rain-soaked dirt with a hint of berries, the fish from dinner last night, and the sweat smell blended with her night-walking clothes. She couldn't distinguish any smells of any other people, other than the 2, maybe 3 juvenile voles who had gotten into the small leather pouches. The wind kicked up, and she recognized the scent of cliff-dwelling birds nearby. That, plus the height of the cave and the difficult entrance, probably discouraged many visitors. I can smell the voles. I can smell that voles were in here, and at first I thought a bear. But that would be one of the furs in the back, wouldn't it? I can smell the carrion smell of a predator bird, and the small birds who like to nest on cliffs. But I don't see any evidence of any actually being in your cave. I can smell the bulrushes in the back, but that doesn't count because I already saw them when I first came over the edge. I can smell moss and sun-baked earth and berries, and my sweat smells like the fish we ate last night. I don't think anyone has been here since you left, and you left long enough ago that your fire from then is indistinguishable from the older fires long before. The grandmother nodded acknowledgement, and then tilted her head toward the firs in the back, indicating it was finally time to sleep. First, the grandmother handed a skin bag to the young girl, indicating she should drink before she went to sleep. There's a large skull furthest from the entrance, under a cleaned hide. If you need to pee, pee there. If you need to do anything else, let me know and we'll go down to the floor. It's not safe for you to be on the floor of the valley alone. You smell too fresh. And with that, the grandmother rolled up in her sleeping hide on top of the mound of brushes. The young girl ignored the rumbling in her stomach, drank some more of the water, relieved herself in the skull that was big enough to sit in, and recovered the skull with the hide. Then she too wrapped herself in the sleeping furs and fell fast asleep. To find out what happens when the grandmother and the young girl are woken up, join us next Monday. May everyone have the week they need, and may we find joy.